Spring, 1945. The Austrian Alps. A Wehrmacht sergeant named Klaus Brenner sat slumped against the stone wall of a mountain farmhouse, his uniform torn, his feet wrapped in newspaper because his boots had disintegrated weeks ago. The war was over, everyone knew it, even if the orders still came down from Berlin. Around him, his unit had scattered into the hills like ghosts, each man carrying nothing but the weight of defeat. But parked in the meadow below, still caked in mud from the last desperate retreat, sat something that didn't belong to the dying Reich. It was small, boxy, painted in olive drab with a white star on the hood. An American Willys Jeep, abandoned, keys still in the ignition. Brenner stared at it for a long time. He had seen hundreds of these vehicles over the past year, pouring through the Ardennes, racing across the Rhine, bouncing over bombed-out roads with an ease that made German half-tracks look like relics from another century. He had watched American soldiers leap out of them, laughing, smoking cigarettes, moving with a carelessness that suggested they had 1,000 more waiting back home. And now, in the silence of surrender, one sat before him like a piece of America itself, left behind in the wreckage of Europe. He walked down to it slowly. The engine was cold. The canvas top flapped in the wind. Inside, on the passenger seat, someone had left a pack of Lucky Strikes and a Hershey bar, half melted. Brenner picked up the chocolate, unwrapped it with trembling fingers, and tasted something he hadn't known in years: abundance. Not luxury, not decadence, just the simple, staggering fact that the Americans could afford to leave things behind. He turned the key. The engine coughed once, then roared to life with a mechanical confidence that seemed almost obscene in a world of broken tanks and silent artillery. Brenner sat there, hands on the wheel, and felt something crack inside him, not his loyalty, not his pride, but his understanding of what the war had really been about. It wasn't ideology. It wasn't willpower. It was this: a nation so wealthy, so industrially unstoppable, that it could scatter 250,000 vehicles across 2 oceans and simply forget about them when the shooting stopped. The Jeep idled. Brenner did not drive away. He just sat there, listening to the engine, realizing that even in defeat, he was surrounded by the future. The WillysMB, military designation for what the world would come to know simply as the Jeep, was not the most advanced weapon of World War II. It carried no guns, dropped no bombs, broke no codes. It was a utility vehicle, a quarter-ton truck designed to haul men and supplies over terrain that would cripple anything else on 4 wheels. And yet, in the years after the war, it became something far stranger: a symbol, a ghost, a piece of American power that refused to die even after the armies went home. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 640,000 Willys Jeeps. They were shipped to every theater of war: Europe, the Pacific, North Africa, China, Burma, the frozen tundra of Alaska, the jungles of New Guinea. They carried generals and privates, medics and engineers, ammunition and mail. Eisenhower called the Jeep one of the 3 tools that won the war, alongside the C-47 transport plane and the atomic bomb. That was not hyperbole. The Jeep was the circulatory system of the American war machine, moving men and material with a speed and reliability that no other army could match. But when the war ended, something unprecedented happened. The United States didn't bring them all home. It couldn't. There were too many, spread too far, in too many places. Shipping them back would have cost more than manufacturing new ones. And so, in a decision that would ripple through the second half of the 20th century, the U.S. military simply left them behind. Tens of thousands of Jeeps were abandoned, sold for scrap, given to Allied governments, or quietly absorbed into the black markets of a shattered world. What happened next was not planned by any general or politician. It was an accident of logistics, a byproduct of abundance. But it changed the world. In the Philippines, in the summer of 1946, a young mechanic named Rogelio Navarro stood in a U.S. Army surplus yard outside Manila, staring at rows of Jeeps parked in the tropical heat like headstones in a military cemetery. The Americans were gone. The war was over. And the Philippine government had just purchased thousands of these vehicles for almost nothing: surplus, obsolete, no longer needed. Navarro had served as a driver for the American forces during the liberation. He knew the Jeep inside and out. The flat-4 engine, the 3-speed transmission, the indestructible simplicity of its design. He also knew that the Philippines, emerging from years of Japanese occupation and American colonial rule, desperately needed transportation. The roads were bombed. The rails were destroyed. The old Spanish-era streetcars were gone. But these Jeeps, these could be rebuilt. He bought one for $20. Then he bought 10 more. He stripped them down, welded on extended chassis, added wooden benches, painted them in wild colors, chrome yellow, electric blue, flame red. He turned them into something new, the jeepney, a hybrid taxi bus that could carry a dozen passengers through the chaotic streets of Manila. Within 5 years, thousands of jeepneys filled the cities of the Philippines, each one a Frankenstein's monster built from the bones of American military surplus. They became the primary mode of public transportation for an entire nation. The jeepney was not just a vehicle, it was a transformation. It took the symbol of American military power and turned it into something civilian, local, Filipino. The jeeps that had carried MacArthur's soldiers back to Leyte now carried schoolchildren, farmers, vendors, lovers, families. They were decorated with religious icons, family names, political slogans. They became rolling folk art, each one unique, each one a declaration that the war was over and the future belonged to the people who lived there. But the story didn't end in the Philippines. In France, in the villages of Normandy and Brittany, farmers found jeeps abandoned in hedgerows and ditches. The Americans had left in a hurry after VE Day, and the French countryside was littered with equipment. At first, the jeeps were scavenged for parts, tires, batteries, engine blocks. But soon, farmers realized the vehicles themselves were valuable. A jeep could plow a field faster than a horse. It could haul firewood, carry milk to market, pull a trailer loaded with hay. French mechanics began converting them, adding agricultural attachments, reinforcing suspensions, painting over the white stars with the names of farms and families. In rural France, where the war had destroyed much of the pre-war vehicle stock, the American Jeep became the backbone of post-war reconstruction. By the early 1950s, it was not uncommon to see a WillysMB, still in faded olive drab, parked outside a stone farmhouse in Provence, its engine rebuilt with tractor parts, its hood decorated with hand-painted flowers. The Jeep had gone from military asset to civilian necessity, and in doing so, it carried with it a quiet, undeniable message. American industrial power was so vast that even its leftovers could rebuild a continent. In Italy, the story was darker. The Jeeps left behind by the Allies became currency in the chaos of the post-war black market. Organized crime syndicates in Naples and Sicily seized them, repainted them, sold them to anyone with cash. Some ended up in the hands of communist partisans in the north, used in skirmishes against royalist forces. Others were smuggled across borders into Yugoslavia, Greece, Albania, where they fueled small wars and insurgencies that would smolder for decades. The Italian government tried to regulate the surplus market, but it was overwhelmed. By 1947, there were an estimated 15,000 unregistered jeeps circulating through Italy, many of them stolen, most of them untraceable. They became symbols of lawlessness, of the breakdown of order in a nation still trying to define itself after Mussolini's fall. But they were also symbols of resilience. In the rubble of bombed-out cities, jeeps hauled bricks and timber. They carried water to neighborhoods without plumbing. They became taxi cabs, delivery trucks, ambulances. In Rome, a black market dealer named Antonio Greco built an entire business around refurbishing American jeeps and selling them to the emerging middle class. He bought them for $50, repainted them, installed new seats, and sold them for $500. He became wealthy. By the 1950s, he owned a fleet of taxis, all of them former U.S. Army vehicles. When asked why he preferred jeeps over European cars, he said something that would have been unthinkable before the war: American machines don't break. They just work. That phrase, they just work, would echo across Europe, across Asia, across every place the jeeps ended up. It was a statement of fact, but also a kind of surrender. The European powers, who had dominated global industry for centuries, had been outbuilt, outproduced, and outlasted by a nation that could afford to leave its machines behind like breadcrumbs. In the Soviet Union, the story was different. The Red Army had received over 50,000 jeeps during the war through the Lend-Lease program. Soviet soldiers loved them. They called them Willys, pronouncing it Vils, and they used them everywhere, from the streets of Stalingrad to the forests of East Prussia. Soviet generals wrote reports praising their reliability, their speed, their ability to traverse mud and snow that would trap Soviet-made trucks. But after the war, Stalin ordered that the jeeps be phased out. They were American. They were capitalist. They were ideologically unacceptable. And so, the Soviet Union began producing its own version, the GAZ-67, a near-exact copy of the WillysMB. Soviet engineers reverse-engineered every bolt, every gear, every line of the design. They changed the name, painted it red, and claimed it as a triumph of Soviet ingenuity. But the soldiers knew. In the motor pools of East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Soviet mechanics still whispered about the original Willys Jeeps, hidden in warehouses, kept running in secret because they were simply better. Even decades later, in the 1970s and 1980s, you could find old Soviet officers who kept a Willys Jeep in a garage somewhere, maintained like a relic, a memory of a time when the Americans had been allies and the future had seemed more open. The Jeep, in the Soviet Union, became a kind of forbidden symbol. It represented not just American technology, but American freedom, the idea that a machine could be mass-produced, distributed freely, and left behind without fear of scarcity. That idea was dangerous. It suggested that abundance was possible, that maybe the ideology of rationing and sacrifice wasn't the only way. In Japan, the Jeeps arrived during the occupation. General MacArthur's forces brought thousands of them, and when the occupation ended in 1952, many were left behind or sold to Japanese companies. At first, the Japanese studied them with the same intensity they had once studied German engineering. They disassembled them, measured every part, analyzed the metallurgy, the welding, the tolerances. What they found shocked them. The Jeep was not elegant. It was not refined. It was crude, even brutal in its simplicity. But it worked. It worked in ways that Japanese vehicles, with their tight tolerances and complex engineering, often didn't. The Jeep could be repaired with a hammer and a wrench. It could run on low-grade fuel. It could be driven by someone with minimal training. It was, in a word, democratic. Japanese engineers took those lessons and applied them to the creation of a new generation of vehicles. The Toyota Land Cruiser, introduced in 1951, was directly inspired by the Willys Jeep. So was the Mitsubishi Jeep, a licensed copy produced for the Japanese self-defense forces. By the 1960s, Japan was exporting vehicles around the world, and every one of them carried the ghost of that original American design, simple, rugged, built to last. A Japanese automotive historian, writing in the 1980s, put it bluntly. We learned more from the American Jeep than we did from 10 years of studying European cars. The Jeep taught us that engineering is not about complexity, it's about function. But perhaps the strangest fate befell the Jeeps left behind in the deserts of North Africa. After the war, thousands of them were simply abandoned in the Sahara, parked in rows outside supply depots in Libya, Algeria, Tunisia. The European powers withdrew. The Americans went home. And the Jeeps sat in the sand. For decades, they remained there, slowly being buried by dunes, their paint scoured off by windstorms, their engines seized by rust. But they didn't disappear. In the 1960s and 1970s, as the newly independent nations of North Africa began exploring their deserts, they found them, fields of Jeeps, half buried, like mechanical fossils. Some were dug up and restored. Others were left as monuments. A few became tourist attractions, pilgrimage sites for military historians and vehicle enthusiasts. In 2003, a French documentary crew filmed an old Tuareg tribesman standing beside a rusted Jeep in the Algerian Sahara. The man was in his 80s. He had been a child during the war, but he remembered the Americans. He remembered the convoys rolling through the desert, the soldiers throwing candy and cigarettes to the children. He remembered the sound of the Jeeps, loud, rattling, unstoppable. These machines, he said, gesturing at the wreck, they came from a country we had never seen. And when they left pieces of themselves behind. I think they wanted us to remember. I think they wanted us to know that they had been here, that they had won, and that they were so powerful they didn't even need to take their weapons home. He was right. The Jeep, in the years after World War II, became something more than a vehicle. It became a haunting, a reminder, a piece of evidence in a case that the world was still trying to understand. How had America done it? How had a nation, only recently emerged from the Great Depression, managed to outproduce, outfight, and outlast empires that had ruled for centuries? The answer, in part, was sitting in fields and garages and junkyards across the world. It was in the engine blocks of Filipino jeepneys and French farm trucks and Soviet copies and Japanese land cruisers. It was in the sheer, undeniable fact of surplus. The United States hadn't just won the war. It had won so decisively, so completely, that it could afford to leave behind hundreds of thousands of vehicles and not even notice. That abundance was terrifying. It was seductive. It was transformative. For the soldiers of the Axis powers, who had fought with dwindling supplies and ersatz materials and the constant knowledge that there was never enough, the sight of an abandoned American Jeep was a kind of revelation. It said, this is what you were up against. Not just soldiers. Not just strategy. But a nation so wealthy that it treated machines like disposable razors. In Germany, after the war, there was a phrase that circulated among veterans. Wir haben gegen die Fabriken gekämpft. We fought against the factories. It was an admission, bitter and resigned, that the war had never been winnable, not because of cowardice or incompetence, but because the industrial might of America was simply beyond comprehension. The Jeep, more than the tank or the bomber, made that clear. It was everywhere. It was indestructible. And it was left behind like litter. By the 1950s, the global proliferation of American Jeeps had become a subject of academic study. Economists wrote papers about the surplus economy of the United States, the phenomenon of a nation so productive that it could export its obsolescence. Sociologists analyzed the cultural impact of American vehicles in post-colonial nations, noting that the Jeep carried with it an implicit ideology, that technology should be accessible, reparable, egalitarian. In contrast, European vehicles of the era, British Land Rovers, French Citroëns, German Volkswagens, were designed with national identity in mind. They were symbols of recovery, of rebuilding, of European resilience. But the Jeep was different. It didn't represent America's recovery. It represented America's surplus. And that surplus, more than any propaganda campaign or Marshall Plan loan, communicated a simple, devastating truth: the Americans had so much that they could give it away and still be the richest nation on earth. That truth reshaped the world. It fueled the consumerism of the 1950s and 1960s, the belief that prosperity was not a zero-sum game, that there could be enough for everyone. It justified the expansion of capitalism into every corner of the globe, because capitalism, unlike the ideologies of scarcity and sacrifice, promised abundance. And the proof was sitting in 1,000 villages, on 1,000 farms, in 1,000 garages. A Willys Jeep, still running, still working, still carrying people forward into a future that America had, almost by accident, designed. But there was a shadow side to this story. The Jeeps left behind were not gifts. They were not charity. They were the residue of empire, the exhaust of a war machine that had consumed the world and left its traces behind. In Vietnam, in the 1960s, American Jeeps would once again flood the countryside, this time as tools of a war that could not be won with machines alone. In Latin America, military juntas would use surplus American vehicles to suppress their own populations, turning the symbols of liberation into instruments of oppression. The Jeep, like all technologies, was morally neutral. It could haul medicine or carry soldiers. It could build a farm or support a dictatorship. What mattered was who controlled it, who decided how it would be used. And in the years after World War II, that question, who controls the machines, became the central question of the Cold War, of decolonization, of the entire second half of the 20th century. The Jeeps left behind were not just vehicles. They were arguments. They were proof that the American way of war, and the American way of life, was predicated on a level of material abundance that most of the world could not imagine. And they were invitations. They said, this could be yours. This ease, this power, this freedom. All you have to do is accept the terms. In the end, Klaus Brenner, the Wehrmacht sergeant in the Austrian Alps, did not drive the Jeep away. He sat in it for an hour, maybe two, listening to the engine, feeling the vibration of American industry humming beneath his feet. Then he turned the key off, climbed out, and walked back up the hill to the farmhouse. The Jeep stayed in the meadow. Years later, in the 1950s, it would be found by a local farmer and converted into a tractor. By the 1970s, it would be sitting in a barn, half buried under hay, forgotten. In 2001, a British collector would buy it for £3,000, restore it, and display it at a military vehicle show in Surrey. People would walk past it, taking pictures, marveling at how something so old could still look so modern. But Brenner never saw that. He died in 1953, in a small apartment in Vienna, a watchmaker by trade, never wealthy, never famous. He told the story of the Jeep only once, to his grandson, who barely remembered it. He said something that the boy didn't understand at the time, something that would only make sense decades later, when the world had changed and the Cold War was over and America had become the last superpower standing. He said, "I knew we had lost when I saw that they could leave things behind. When you are winning, you take everything. When you have already won, you leave gifts." The Jeep was a gift. An accidental, unintentional, surplus gift. But it was also a message, written in steel and rubber and engine oil, a message that echoed across the ruins of Europe and Asia and Africa: this is what victory looks like. Not conquest. Not occupation. But abundance so vast that even the leftovers can change the world. And they did.